Hello everyone, Steven here with Rabid Hobbies, and we're back with another Trench Crusade video. Today I'm going to be painting the Drowned Witch from the DakkaDakkaStore's new Kickstarter, The Disciple of Tet'o, launching soon on November 11th. This is the coolest version of the Artillery Witch I've ever seen, which is saying something because I've seen a lot of cool versions of this mini. This Kickstarter features 2 whole warbands inspired by Call of Cthulhu. One is a perfect stand-in for the Heretic Legion, and the other is a Lovecraftian take on the Black Grail. Let's check it out. Here I have the Drowned Witch fresh off my 3D printer. Still have some cleanup to do. I used my X-Acto knife to carefully cut away the supports. This took a little bit of time, but it wasn't that bad. Most of the supports just kind of snapped off with gentle pressure. I used a sanding twig to clean up any areas that needed sanding. She cleaned up pretty nice. All the supports were very smartly placed to not obscure any detail. This is such a gorgeous sculpt. I decided to leave off the third mine while I'm painting it. I'll glue it back on when I'm mostly done. I went ahead and printed the entire range of STLs that the DakkaDakkaStore had sent me. This allowed me to build 2 whole warbands for Trench Crusade, one representing the Black Grail and one representing the Heretic Legion. Also, I'm low-key stoked that my new 3D printer allows me to show you these time lapses. Everything from the Kickstarter printed without a hitch. This matriarch here makes a great stand-in for a Lord of Tumors. A lot more Eldritch and a lot less nasty. This is just a gorgeous model. I love the detail on the braids here. You've got the Keepers, which make great stand-ins for models like Anointed or Plague Knights. They have both gun and melee versions available. I can definitely see these being used with like Grimdark Future for one-page rules. Here we've got a good stand-in for a Death Commando. This Herald here would make a great Heretic Priest. These Idolaters are perfect stand-ins for Heretic Legion troopers. Anyways, back to the Witch. For stability, I decided to use a 32mm base. It just seemed to fit the model better. In the Trench Crusade playtest rules, it says she needs to be on a 25mm base, which just seems bonkers to me. Quick look around, and it looks like almost every other version I can find is on a bigger base than a 25, so let's go with that. Plus, it'll give me a chance to do something fun with the base. I've used these wooden coffee stirrers before with my Deathcore of Krieg to make trench bases. Word to the wise, do not use your good clippers for this. If you have like God Hand or Flesh Cut clippers, you will break them. Don't become a statistic. First, I glue 2 of the sticks onto the base using some super glue. This dries really fast. Then you trim the sticks back to the edge of the base, kind of like cutting toenails. Be careful, these things can go flying. Now you're left with something like this. So basically, I layer boards in the opposite direction, creating something that looks like trench duck boards. Now before I went any further, I decided to put some earth texture on the base. Just kind of spreaded it all around. This might be an OCD thing on my part, like you're not going to see that much. Maybe if you have broken boards or gaps in your boards. But anyways, I'll know it's there. So I keep making my duck boards. Until I'm almost done, and I decided to leave this little end portion off. Maybe do like a broken or missing board here. Just clip off all the rest of these. Then you end up with something like this. Next, to add some more detail to it, I whip out my favorite rotary tool. The Fanttik F2 Master has been a freaking game changer for me. It's got a ton of different attachments to it. The magnet system is just amazing. For this, I'm going to use my smallest drill bit attachment to drill out some holes in the duck boards. So British duck boards from World War I were often held together with these really large nails, which are kind of hard to get in scale for 25mm. So what I decided to use was paper clips instead. At this scale, it's more like a railroad spike size, but I think it looks good. I quickly drilled the rest of the holes in the other boards. This tool is so much faster than my manual pin vise. Now it's starting to look good, but the wood is looking a little flat, so I decided to grab one of my diamond tip carving bits. I use this to roughly carve in some wood grain. I plan on oil washing this miniature, and when the oil settles into these recesses, it should give a nice wood grain effect. By the way, if you want to get one of these rotary tools for yourself, I've included the link in the video description. Next, I used a bunch more paper clips to finish up all the nails. I glued these up with some super glue and some super glue accelerant. Then I just trimmed up the excess. And in the end, this is what I was left with. Not too shabby for a homemade trench base. Definitely think the 32mm base looks way better in scale. Now to attach her to the base, I drilled another hole for another paperclip. This I superglued in place with some more accelerant. I did a quick test fit and I think she looks great on the base like this. There's no way I'm going to paint her like that with that point of attachment though, so I decided to use my manual pin vise as a painting handle, which I've done before. I usually use this for small things like Space Marine heads, but for her I think this will be awesome. Now it's time to prime. I attach the base to this painting handle with some poster tack. I'm priming through my airbrush with some Pro Acryl Black primer. I primed everything in a thin coat of black and gave it 24 hours to dry. I've found with airbrush primers that this gives the best adhesion. Alright, on to painting. First a base coat of dark jade from Pro Acryl, and then a zenithal highlight with some bright neutral gray and some white blue. I always start with some flow improver first. Add my paint, add a little bit of water, a quick stir and good to go. This dark jade will be a base coat for her cloak and also kind of a chromatic shadow for the rest of the model. My goal is for this drowned witch to be mostly in cool colors. For her skin, I decided to go with red-gray as a base. I hit this over all of her fleshy features as a base tone. The skin, the more humanoid parts, and also the tentacles. I then came in with the white blue and I added some highlights. I brightened up the skin quite a bit along with the tentacles because I intend to use some speed paints over the top. Alright, now it's time to whip out our brush. I used some warm brown to paint the mud on the base. I don't worry about highlighting this because I will be adding the oil wash later, as I said before. Next, I broke out my fidget palette because we're going to use some speed paints. I decided to use some pallid bone to base coat the duck boards. This, I just kind of slapped it all over. This I didn't quite like the look of, so I know I'll be painting over it later. It was an experiment. Mistakes were made. Now to fix it, I decided to use some dark ivory. I immediately knew that this was the right choice. This nice and light color is going to darken down tremendously once I apply a burnt umber wash. I don't want full opacity here, I want some color variation. I decided that I wanted the human parts of the drowned witch to look like the little sisters from Bioshock. Something about their deathly skin and their eerie glowing eyes just called to me. For her skin, I decided on a mix of Gravelord Grey and Bony Matter. I wanted this to be more of a filter, so I added some speed paint medium to thin it down. Gave it a quick stir. Right away I could see this was definitely the look I was going for. I don't use speed paints all that often, to be honest, but sometimes I just find a good application that I like the results on, and this is one of them. I used Battleship Gray to shade her hair. I figured this would be a good shadow color for that white blue that I sprayed on earlier. This turned out to be the right choice. Next, it was time for some wet blending that cloak. I'll be using black green, dark jade, jade, and bright jade. I set these all up on my palette so I can do some blending of colors. This is one of the things I love having a wet palette for. I start with a blend of the black green and the dark jade for my darkest base color. I use this to base coat the cloak all over. In the recesses, I'm using a little more of the black green, and on the upper edges of the cloak, I'm adding a little bit more of the blue. This wet blending will allow for a bit of a smooth color gradient that I might use an airbrush for, but in this case, I was afraid of overspray. It's important when you're wet blending to allow the previous layers to dry, so in the meantime I went back to some of that white blue, mixed with some dark ivory to highlight her hair. I'm very deliberate as to where I'm placing these highlights and careful about the consistency on my paintbrush. I always make sure to test on the back of my hand. When the cloak is dry, it's time to head back to the cloak. I continue to layer it up using very, very thin transparent layers. Using very thin layers is important to eliminate any lines where the colors don't blend together. We're looking for a gradient and not streaking. When the paint is still wet, it may seem a little opaque, but when it dries, you'll see the results of this thin glaze. Now when I do paint cloaks, I do tend to make my brush strokes in the direction that the cloth is flowing. It's important from time to clean off your brush completely. You don't want any paint to dry on your brush during this process. As you can see from my palette, I'm slowly going from darker to lighter. Yeah, it takes me a long time to paint these, but I love the results that I get. I actually really enjoy painting cloaks, and I used to hate it. What do you folks think? Leave a comment, let me know, do you like painting cloaks or is it a chore? For me, cloth is one of the things I look forward to while painting a model. For me, the thing I dread the most is base coating, which is where I use my airbrush as much as possible. With a final highlight, I'm going to call this cloak done. Now in between this, I actually glued her onto the base, which was a mistake. I used this index card to mask off the base for this next highlight step. I airbrushed some Army Painter Speed Paint Plasmatic Bolt. I really love the way that Speed Paint works through an airbrush. It's actually very nice as a color filter. It doesn't behave like it does with a brush, instead it just tints whatever surface you spray it on. Because of how dark her cloak is, I'm not even afraid of overspray at this point. You really only see it on the very highlighted portions of the model. And because all of these colors are greens, it really doesn't matter if I get any overspray on that cloak. Now we need a little bit of help from my friend, Silly Putty.
Yeah, Silly Putty is fun.
I noticed a spot on our tentacle where I sprayed the plasmatic bolt a little too thick, and I want to fix that.
Dummy thick.
Right up here on the top of this tentacle. So I masked off that area of Silly Putty, and I'm going to be using some bright pale green to highlight. This masking was essential because this is a very opaque paint. I'm hoping to give a little bit of a bioluminescent sort of vibe. Immediately I love the way this looks. It's just great when what you envision beforehand turns out on your model. Now we just gotta pull off our Silly Putty masking and we're good to go. If you want to learn more about using Silly Putty in your hobby and also about the science and history of Silly Putty, check out the video above. Now my drowned witch is starting to look pretty nice. She's starting to look like what I envisioned when I started painting her. Now I think it's time to move on to the metals. We gotta paint those mines, those chains, those locks, and that face mask. Time to blend some metallics. For this, I'll be using death metal. I'll be mixing this with Vallejo Metal Color Steel, a beautiful liquid steel. Death metal is a lot more viscous. My goal here was a darker, grungier steel, and these colors blend together beautifully. I slapped this all over the chains and the mines. For the chains, I used a little bit more of the death metal, and for the mines, I used a bit more of the steel. My goal was for a subtle contrast between the metals and not a jarring impact between the two. As you can see, the coverage is really good on these metallics. You'll notice I'm using a bit of a larger brush for this first step, and I do that as much as I can, but some of these recesses, like around this tentacle, I'm going to need to switch to a smaller brush. One of the biggest aha moments I had in painting was realizing that you need to use the biggest brush that you can get away with as much as possible to speed up your painting. Alright, time to swap down to a super fine brush for the little bitty details. First I go in and hit all those hard to reach areas. Then I painted all the other tiny minutiae on her. That Scold's bridal mask, her locks that are around her waist and arms. I'm sure you're noticing my magnifying glasses there. My eyes are not what they used to be. Next, I went back in with some more white blue to pop up my highlights a little more. Now, when I paint white, I rarely if ever go to pure white, and this is one of those cases. I always prefer like a chromatic white that has a little bit of another color in it. This is a very bright white, but it has a subtle amount of cool blue. Next, I went in and I dotted her eyes. I painted a little bit outside the eyeball itself to give a glowing effect once I add fluorescence on. Don't skip this step when using fluorescents, they're very transparent. I figured that I'd be safe to glue on my mine at this point. I pulled it off the paper clip, applied a little CA glue, and popped it on my witch. Now for my fluorescence, I used some Lens Flare Glow from Army Painter War Paints. I use this on my fidget palette because it's already thin enough, I don't want to add any water to it. Just the tiniest little drop in each eyeball is all you need for this. And I think it provides a pretty cool effect. Once it was dry, I did one more layer, this time touching the orbit of the eye. This I feel like really enhances the glowing effect. The effect is even crazier under a black light. One day I have a goal to paint an entire army using UV effect paint. Maybe Eldar, or maybe Nighthaunt for Age of Sigmar. Looking at her now, she kind of looks like a Nighthaunt model. Alright, before the oil wash, I have to seal her up with some high gloss varnish. This is going to seal away all the hard work that I've done underneath and protect those layers for when I put on the oil paint. I can always use mineral spirits and revert back to this initial state, which is great. It's almost like saving your work. Alright, time for an oil wash. For this I'll be using Ivory Black and Burnt Umber. If you want a full tutorial on how to do an oil wash, check out the video above. I start out with pure Burnt Umber for the parts that I want to look more grungy, with a little bit of black added in, just to darken it down a tad. I slap this grungy oil wash all over the base. I also put it all over the mines and chains. I carefully brushed a very thin layer all over the rest of the model. The one place that I was careful to avoid was the eyes. Now before waiting for the oil wash to set, I was careful to come back in with a makeup sponge and clean up the areas that I wanted to remain brighter. The hair and the tentacles in particular, I wanted to be free of most of the oil wash. I also cleaned up the upper areas of her skin. I came in with a clean brush with some mineral spirits, and I tidied up those areas that I wanted to remain bright. Here's how she was looking before I left her to dry. And now here she is after 90 minutes of drying time. Still have some cleanup to do, especially on those tentacles. Also her cloak. I apply some pure mineral spirits to a makeup sponge. Now I go in and I clear up that excess oil wash. This is by far the most satisfying part of oil washing in my opinion. I think she's looking pretty gorgeous, like she's almost done. Overall, she's a bit too shiny, we gotta knock that back, but I want to preserve the shininess on the tentacles. But I don't want her hair, her skin, or her cloak to be shiny. So it's back to the spray booth for a quick blast of matte varnish. Even if you don't want to use airbrushes to paint your minis, there's a use case for using them just for varnishing. I've seen too many people use testers or other types of matte varnishes and completely ruin miniatures by frosting them over. And what I really love by using an airbrush for this step is the amount of control that you have over the process. Breaking my fidget palette out again one more time for the last step of the process with some high gloss varnish and some black for the base rim. Variance in texture is something I find really important when grimdark painting. So I'm coming back in with this high gloss varnish to really sell the slippery, slimy, eel-like tentacles. It's also time to paint our base rim black. If you don't think that black is the best color for a base rim, fight me in the comments. Painting our base rim is our super satisfying moment when we know that all our hard work is paid off and another mini is about to go in the cabinet. Or the tabletop. Time to roll out the red carpet for our grand reveal of our drowned witch. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Remember to leave a comment, like, and subscribe, and check out the DakkaDakkaStore's Kickstarter Disciple of Tet'o launching on November 11th.